And immediately they wanted to jump in and talk about my childhood and trauma that I must have experienced. And that really didn't resonate with me. I'm a middle class white kid that grew up in Oakland, California in the 90s. I have a lot of, really close friends that, man, don't have anything near what I have in terms of family support or education or access to resources. And I really just kind of felt like, you know, this is a problem for real people. This is a problem for people that have real problems. Like, I'm just being a baby. And the therapist recommended that I go to Gamblers Anonymous, which I was really hesitant to do. I didn't know that Gamblers Anonymous existed before that point. I was only familiar with AA. And I was living in my hometown, and I thought, if I walk into a meeting, somebody's going to know me, right? That this was a big secret in my life, and I didn't want to be found out. So eventually, after a couple months of hemming and hawing, I waited until I was on a business trip, and I went to my first GA meeting in Phoenix, Arizona, where I thought nobody would know me. And it was exactly what I had pictured in my head. It was a dusty church basement in a kind of sketchy part of town. And it was the first time that I said out loud to a room full of people, I'm a compulsive gambler. And I think that was powerful, like being in the same room as other people that, had this problem. But as I started to share my experience, gambling online, using cryptocurrency, doing leveraged options trading, or, sneaking off to the bathroom in my tech job to spin a slot machine on my phone, the other people that were sharing were saying, I've been in recovery for 30 years from the horse track in the 80s or the casino where I used to play the slot machine. And I just felt like, man, I'm an anomaly. These people don't really understand what I'm going through. They don't understand my life. And after forcing myself to go to therapy and go to GA at least a couple times a week, I eventually gave up. I couldn't stop gambling. I was literally leaving my therapist's office and, paying $150 an hour to talk to them, and then gambling on my phone in the elevator, leaving the office. And I just kind of accepted, I'm an addict. Like, I see that I have an addiction. This is who I am, but I've been managing this for 10 years. Nobody knows. Outwardly, I'm successful. Like, I just have to keep it up. That was a bad decision, right? I think in retrospect, that was a really bad decision. It probably took 18 months or so for the wheels to come off the bus in my life. And what eventually got me found out and kind of got me into recovery was not the gambling itself. It was the other kind of symptoms. I started drinking more. I felt so socially isolated that when I was drunk and my friends were drunk, that was the only time that I felt like we were actually authentically on the same page. And, drinking was never really part of my life too much before that. I also started using cocaine because I think I was sleeping probably 2 hours or less a night. And for the first time, it really started to show up in my work. I could always kind of make it happen. I could always do what I needed to do. But, the lack of sleep, the stress, all of this really started to contribute to me struggling at work. And eventually, I proposed to my fiance at the end of 2019, around October, and she said yes. And then about 2 months later, she gave me an ultimatum. And she said, look, 80% of the time, you're great and I want to marry you. And 20% of the time, you're totally unrecognizable. Like, I don't know if you're cheating on me. I don't know if you have a drug problem, but whatever it is, if you don't tell me, we can't get married. And that was the real turning point for me. Up until then, I had never really confided in anybody close to me. And I really rationally saw, my future, the life that I want, a wife and kids and stability is right here in front of me. And gambling is ruining my life. If I don't quit, if I can't quit, if I choose gambling over this future, like, what's the point? So I very rationally decided that I was going to tell her and I was going to quit for her, or I was going to kill myself. because I was just at that point. Um, and obviously, I'm very lucky. I'm still here. When I told my fiance, to her credit, she didn't know anything about addiction or gambling, definitely not gambling addiction. But she took the position of, I'm smart. We're smart. We have access to resources. Like, people figure this out, and we're gonna figure this out. Um, and we did. It was a lot of logistics. It felt really good to tell somebody in my life, for the first time, even though I felt really ashamed about my behavior. It was really helpful to have somebody that I felt like was on the same team. And I gave up my financial control to her, and I started reading a lot about addiction and the neuroscience of addiction. And as I learned more about what was happening in my brain and my dopamine cycle, I kind of evolved my perspective from I am this morally bankrupt, terrible person, to when I gamble, I'm putting drugs into my brain. And the way that I behave on that substance of gambling is not the person that I want to be. And I stopped. It's the first time in my life really that I was able to stop gambling, and everything got better.